My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of Rebuild NorthBay Foundation. This podcast is specifically designed to bring you people who have been through what maybe you have just gone through or that you are concerned about. We created the podcast How to Disaster to show you the breadth and depth of humanity in the midst of this really terrible thing that happened. I wanted to do this podcast so that I could bring some of the most amazing leaders that I've ever known in my life to you. You may have just experienced a disaster, and you may be looking around and you are dealing with trauma and the shock of it. And you may be wondering, I don't know how to do this part. And so we purposefully made this podcast into different sections and different topics of recovery so that you could pick and choose what would work for you at that time. So welcome to How to Disaster, and thank you for giving us your time. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster. Today, I'm so pleased to have with us Dr. Lisa Micheli. Dr. Micheli is a leader in the area of forest resiliency and restoration, especially when it comes to wildfires. She is the CEO and president of Pepperwood Preserve and has been a board member for Rebuild NorthBay for over 3 years. I really loved working with Lisa because she has an innovative approach, she's collaborative, and she's always curious about how can we make this process better and more accessible in order to build our resiliency. So once again, I'm so pleased to welcome to the podcast, Dr. Lisa Micheli. Once again, thank you, Dr. Lisa Micheli, for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Jen, for having me come visit you today.
I'm very excited because I've loved working with you over the past 3 years, and I'm hoping that you can tell our audience and our listeners a little bit about your background, the work that you do, and your current position with Pepperwood Preserve.
Sure. Well, I am an environmental scientist. I've spent my whole career really working for government, universities, and agencies. I started my career at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. My specialty area within scientific research is really understanding the relationship between water and ecosystems. And one of the things I like to share is, I chose water as a study area, and to some extent fire chose me. But especially given that we are wrestling with drought and the relationship between drought and fire, my background is really as a physical scientist, understanding how water cycles through the land. And now I'm doing a lot of work looking at the relationships between hydrology, climate change, forests, both in terms of fire resilience, but also biodiversity protection and climate resilience in general.
So one of the interesting things that's been interesting to watch from an outsider's perspective who's not a scientist is that you've had to navigate multiple fires at Pepperwood Preserve. Can you actually talk to us about what is Pepperwood Preserve and the history of fire, especially over the last 3.5 years there, and some of the more innovative things you've done, including placing wildfire cameras on there?
Sure. Well, I have the incredible privilege of working at what's known as Pepperwood Preserve, and we have a center there called the Dwight Center for Conservation Science. We were originally founded as the field station for the California Academy of Sciences, and we continue a relationship with the Academy, but luckily for us, 2 local philanthropists, Herb and Jane Dwight, kind of adopted the preserve and the property and created a foundation specifically focused on boosting the educational and scientific value of the property as a living laboratory. So we have an incredible small team on site of educators who are also trained in the sciences and scientific researchers, and then really land management specialists. And we utilize the preserve as a venue for education, but also for demonstrating resilience strategies. And what I love to do, the dream as part of the job, is I put together these ideal teams of scientists from different disciplines to answer very applied questions. So we host a lot of university researchers, but as a research facility, we're really focused on recruiting the scientists we need to answer pressing questions, including the fire resilience challenge that we're facing today. We know historically that Pepperwood had burned over in the 1965 Hanley fire that started in Calistoga and then worked its way to Santa Rosa. And we're located in that mountain range directly in between sort of the Napa Valleys, Knights Valley, and Santa Rosa area. And that fire took several days to spread, took no lives, and took out about 100 structures. And so in 2017, the Tubbs fire, which reoccupied very much the same footprint as the Hanley fire, ripped through in a matter of hours, devastated our community in terms of loss of life and property. And our property was really in the headwater, if you can think of the headwaters of that fire. So we are one of the first properties on the Sonoma County side impacted. My team sprang into action and helped to evacuate our community, which is very rural, and a lot of elders in our community. And we lost 6 of our structures in 2017, our barn office, all of our equipment, our research equipment, and 2 residences, in addition to some outbuildings. So we really had the experience of being impacted directly by the fire. We had been threatened in 2015 by the Valley Fire. And at that time, I called my insurance company. I said, well, we have all this scientific equipment out deployed on the preserve because we have instruments all over the preserve to monitor weather and biological indicators over time. And she assured me that it was covered on my insurance policy. So we have an incredible data set of conditions on the landscape before the fire, what happened during the fire, and now we're monitoring the recovery of the landscape after the fire. So we're neighbors, we're part of the community. We have members of our staff whose families lost lives in the fire. And so we really are at the front lines of the direct impact, but then we're also the hub for the science that we can do in the wake of that impact. And we're really sitting on a gold mine of data because most of the scientific research on fire in California has been based in either Southern California or the Sierras. And this is one of the first times that a scientific community has been able to capture the impacts of fire in the Coast Range that characterizes the Sonoma, Napa, Lake Mendocino areas.
I think that's actually a really important place to put a pin in because while forest restoration is critical no matter what type of forest or land you have, but what the treatments that you use and your approach has to actually be appropriate for that wildfire area. I like it as a metaphor for how we serve communities. While there are certain best practices, there are also, like, every community is its own, has its own characteristics and its own path to recovery back. What has surprised you the most in what you've learned over the last 3.5 years? Because you have been burned, not as extensively, but you've had 3 burns in 3.5 years. So what has surprised you the most about that work?
Well, I think, what first surprised me is that we were even surprised, right? Because as scientists, we knew that we lived in a fire adapted ecosystem and it was likely to happen to us sooner or later. And even though we had that information, we were just as shocked and impacted as anyone else in the community. We've been doing a lot of work to connect Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge to our Western scientific knowledge. And I think, first of all, just understanding that the state of the forest as we in the 20th century look at it, it actually reflects, from a Native American point of view, a lack of stewardship. And so we knew at Pepperwood that we had about 10 times as many trees per unit area as probably were there historically under Native stewardship. And this is because we largely stopped fire from coming into, we've been really good at putting fires out. And so in our area, which is characterized by these gorgeous, oak woodlands, more hardwood and mixed montane hardwood, say compared to the Sierras where you have mostly coniferous trees, meaning like Christmas trees, the forest has really changed dramatically from what would have been a more sustainable framework. And yet we're very attached to the way it looks today.
I think most people haven't seen, unless you've been in a wildfire affected area, you don't grow up. We have generations now that have not grown up with what a forest is supposed to look like and how clean it's supposed to be. And we thought for so long that every tree was precious. And so, it's very difficult to sort of change that paradigm, but I appreciate the fact that people like you and you specifically are working on changing that very important paradigm about land management and a return to indigenous practices at the center, not as input.
Well, and I think, the field of conservation and where conservation science centered, that gives you the idea that things are frozen. But we already knew under climate change that we had to understand that things were changing, whether we like it or not. We want to keep things the way they were. But to really be resilient in the future, we need to adapt to the fact that fire is a necessary part of the ecosystem, and that with climate change, the dynamics behind fire are changing. And in fact, our risks are going up largely because of the impact of this excess heat that we're generating through our greenhouse gas emissions. That really dries out the soil, sort of like a blow dryer blowing on the soils. The biggest surprise I had, I think, after the fires came through was how quickly nature does rebound. Basically, one little rainstorm triggers this incredible unfolding of life in the landscape. And I think that was really a balm for our community members to be able to come to the preserve and see how nature actually thrives after fire, right? In some cases, you're basically clearing away a lot of dead material that fire normally refreshes and renews, and then that material turns into a fertilizer for the seed bed that's there. And we had an anticipation that we'd see many rare plants and flowers that hadn't been seen for a long time, because we do have these species that are fire adapted or even require fire to reproduce. So there were certain flowers that hadn't bloomed on the preserve for over 52, 53 years. And they'd been dormant since the day I was born, and then this was their chance to bloom. I think one of the biggest surprises, though, was the number of invasive plants and weeds that also popped out of the ground, and that the fire did not just favor native species, but there was a whole lot of really difficult to deal with and very flammable weeds like broom, Scotch broom, French broom, thistles that just sort of were waiting for this opportunity as well. So there were no rules of thumb about exactly what was going to happen next. And I guess that I'll just say there are pros and cons from the idea of land management of the fire coming through and how we respond.
Well, I think this is actually a good segue to bring us into the North Bay Forest Improvement Program, which is under the auspices of Rebuild NorthBay Foundation, but was really brought to us through you. And it's a pilot program, it's innovative, it's collaborative, and it addresses the very real issue of how to do forest restoration and land management in a way that is ecologically responsible. So can you talk about that program and what it can actually mean for people?
Well, one of the things that's different about our part of California from the rest of the US West is that the majority of the forest resources and natural vegetation is privately owned. So in many parts of the US, it's the US Forest Service that is managing your local forest. They have a pretty well structured management system. It's been woefully underfunded, and a lot of nonprofits and NGOs have stepped in to help provide stewardship resources to that forest. But it's more of a straight path because you have one large property owner, the US government, who owns the whole landscape and has the power to make changes about how it's managed. In Sonoma County, we think about 80% of our natural lands are on private parcels, and there's about 17,000 different parcels. So imagine there's at least 17,000 different owners of this land. And a lot of these folks are private landowners. This is their backyard. It's a residential site. So the challenge in helping to come up with what I call landscape scale solutions, which is really what fire requires, because it's responding to the whole mountain range. It's not just parcel by parcel. How do we get to those private landowners and give them technical assistance and some financial incentives to do this work, because the work is very expensive. So I was delighted to be working with our resource conservation districts. For folks who don't know what that is, it's a special district that was formed first in response to the Dust Bowl crisis. And they were created as local hubs in rural communities where technical assistance and funds could be distributed to farmers to work on soil erosion was a lot of the issue, right? We were losing our soil. So these groups now actually, and it's been a big push in our community to make sure that the local resource conservation districts have foresters now available to people in our neighborhood. So the North Bay Forest Improvement Program is really a coalition of resource conservation districts across 4 counties. And through teamwork, Rebuild North Bay was able to serve as the fiscal sponsor, apply for a grant on behalf of those districts, and then set up an application process where private landowners can apply for a project, and that project is vetted by our foresters, and then we're able to provide a matching fund for them to be able to get some of the work done. I love this project. It was a very collaborative project. It filled an obvious need. CAL FIRE is very happy about it because its typical forest funding pathway doesn't necessarily serve this small private landowner as well as it should. And what's nice is this is a vehicle for some of the, there's landowner coalitions forming right now. I mean, one thing I know you've emphasized in this podcast is the need for neighbors to know one another and to have that neighborhood connectivity and capacity building. And those are really the same groups, the disaster response groups and the fire safe councils that are forming are the same groups that we're working with, so that instead of reaching one landowner at a time, we can support maybe 200 landowners in one basin or on one mountain with planning. And the goal here is to achieve economies of scale. It's expensive to write these plans. There aren't that many foresters to work on them. So if we can scale up the area of treatment and get landowners to team up together, then we can save time in terms of the planning and environmental compliance.
And from a practical perspective, it also honors the fact that fire really doesn't care about your county line. It doesn't care about your parcel line. It's going to go where it wants to go. It's going to go where the fuel is. And one of the things I've learned from you over the past 3 years is how important it is to actually map out where the greatest risks are, so we can use data to actually target where we should be spending our resources. So can you talk about that work too? Because I think that's important, and I think it's something that could be and should be applied throughout the American West, where we're most wildfire vulnerable.
This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So, when I first got involved with this work, and I think you always need to go to the boots on the ground people to figure out what's going on. And so I talked to our local CAL FIRE, vegetation management team members, and I said, well, how do you prioritize where work needs to happen? And they said, well, we get in our trucks and we drive around and we look for problem areas. And I said, but you have maps theoretically of, where fuels are hazardous or where there's high fire severity risks. And they said, yeah, but those are statewide maps. And this is a lot of the work that Pepperwood gets involved with. It's a statewide map. It's intended to give decision makers in Sacramento a snapshot of conditions. It's not really meant to be used for planning exactly where to do work on the ground. So we were excited because we've been very involved with using new kinds of data sources, sensors that can be put on airplanes, sensors that can be put on satellites to help map these forest resources. And that technology is just getting good enough now that you can really start to see individual trees. And we can fly an airplane over with a laser and get sort of a 3D map of the forest structure, which is not just the top of the canopy and the number of trees, and that's been a big focus, but what's underneath. So a lot of what we've learned is that the risk of fire is really correlated with how dense what we call the vegetation fuels are in the subcanopy. the stuff that's growing close to the ground. It's shrubby, it's young dug fir saplings, and we call those ladder fuels. Those are fuels that the fire will climb up those smaller trees or shrubs and get up into the canopy. And we're able to show that these ladder fuels combined with a drought metric, which my team had developed, were the two best predictors of where the canopy burned off in 2017. That was a study done with NASA.
For people who are not scientists, and just to back up for 1 second, the way that I try to explain it, as you've explained it to me, is it's an amazing thing to be able to see beneath the canopy to what I call the garbage forest that shouldn't be there. And it can be mitigated, because explain to our audience, what's the danger when the fire reaches all the way up into the canopy and burns too hot and too fast?
Yeah, I mean, the ladder fuels are the vehicle of creating a really big mega fire. Native American burns, controlled burns, cultural burns, the kind of burns we use at Pepperwood is what we call a ground fire. And the ground fire, literally, the fire scientists talk about the flame lengths, are under a foot. You've got these little flames creeping along the ground, and they're just going to help recycle the duff or the garbage that you're talking about on the ground. Some people would call it something else, but what the ladder fuel does is let those flames climb up and become 30 or 40 or 100 foot high conflagrations, because it starts to ignite the whole tree. And, especially oak trees and redwood trees in our area, they have very thick bark. And you can have a pretty hot fire burning around their base and they're going to be just fine. But if that fire climbs up into the canopy, it will likely kill the tree. And so canopy burn is one of the most important indicators of a very severe or very hot fire, because these trees can survive a typical kind of fire, but the canopy burn has the potential to actually kill the tree. And sometimes the whole tree will get burnt up, but often that tree will be standing and dead. And that means when the next fire comes, like in 2019, when Kincaid came to us, there were standing dead trees left over from the previous fire, and they're very flammable because they're no longer green, they're no longer holding water. So this idea that once a fire burns, there's not much left to burn, sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not, and it's very patchy. And in places where you have canopy burn, it's sort of a little counterintuitive, but you've had a very hot burn and it's leaving behind fuel that could burn in a subsequent fire. So
it's sending embers, or the ember cast is much worse, and a lot of the damage and the wildfire spread, mega fire spread, comes from ember cast specifically. So that's about the extent of my knowledge.
When we talk about, I mentioned the term ground-driven fire. Well, the other kind of fire is the wind-driven fire, and that's really what the first 24 hours of the Tubbs fire was. It was a wind-driven fire. At Pepperwood, we measured 77 miles per hour at one of our weather stations. That's even in a slightly protected area. So once you're in that situation where the fire is moving quickly and you start getting that canopy burn, the fire moving up the trees, then you have the perfect source of embers for those wicked winds to be spreading. And one tree on fire could spread thousands of embers. But I also want to, we're talking a lot about trees catching on fire and spreading the fire. What we learned in 2017 is that homes actually are a bigger source of fire and heat intensity. And that's something that the scientific literature hadn't really captured. Fire models usually assume the fire is going to burn, but that a subdivision won't necessarily. And that's something we learned, that, when you get these ember-driven events and the houses catch fire, the housing and the developments in the rural areas end up being the hottest and most intense burning areas, and they in turn become probably the major source of embers and spread as well. So our local fire department said, it's not just that we're protecting houses against fire that comes from the trees, but really the houses become, in a big conflagration like that, what is igniting the forest downwind.
That brings up two things. The first thing I think about is, how do we, why should we spend public funds? I was just asked this question by a reporter, and he said, why should a nurse in Des Moines help to, pay for, through her taxes, wildland fuel mitigation on private lands? And also, why should they help for home hardening? because there are programs that are coming down the line already. Some exist, and we've done this with floods for generations and generations, but not wildfire. Like, how do you actually, why should you use public funds in order to mitigate the risk in the wildlands on privately owned land? You should answer that question, not me, but I want to see you say.
So I think that's a great question. Like, why should an individual in one location be helping to invest in a private property improvement program that is reducing fire hazards? And it really gets to the issue that I've been learning from a fellow named Bob Ewing, is the mismatch between the risk and the benefits and who bears the cost. And that's the thing, is if you live in a rural landscape and you're a private landowner, when you work on your property, you are benefiting everybody downwind of that property, right? And the benefit of you investing in that work on site goes beyond your individual property. So that's why we are promoting these financial and governance innovations around how can we meet this problem, because part of why we're stuck in this situation is it's overwhelming for that individual forest landowner to do the work that's needed, and yet we all benefit from the water supply, we all benefit from the fire hazard reduction and the biodiversity that that property is retaining. So I think the idea is sharing the cost and seeing a collective value to the work that we're doing and being willing to invest in that person who maybe is in a critical position to help reduce our hazard, because they're not just reducing the hazard on their land, they're reducing the hazard for all of us.
And the cost of forest restoration or treatment to do fuel mitigation is actually very high. So that's one of the things that I was talking to the same reporter about. Was I said, someone may have a $7 million, a net worth of say $7 million, but if it's going to cost them $2 million to mitigate the fuel and to have any kind of ongoing program to mitigate the fuel, they're not very likely to do it. So it is a matter of also ensuring that we are incentivizing and partnering for the safety of everyone, including our long-term ecology. And so that's why I love that you brought NBFIP to Rebuild North Bay. Now, one of the barriers to entry for a lot of nonprofits would be that we also had to put forth $200,000 in a revolving loan fund that will come back to us, but we had to be able to afford to do that. And a lot of smaller nonprofits would not have been able to put up a revolving loan fund or commit that money for a 3-year term. And so I applaud you for coming in early and saying, here's how we should allocate these funds, and it took time. What is your hope to see this actually, because it is scalable, to actually see this replicated in other areas across the state and even across the American West?
Well, just to explain what the challenge is for an NGO that's trying to step into this really public service gap, is that if you get a public grant, it is on a reimbursable basis. So you do the work before you can get reimbursed for the work. So you have to have a pretty large reserve as an individual organization to cover that. And we wanted to be able to get the resources to the landowners in a timely fashion too, so that it really helped defray the costs. I think the opportunity is that I understand there's a lot of green and sort of angel investors out there who are interested in loan situations that either be a no interest or low interest loan. And I think for those investors, these kinds of programs are an incredible opportunity to facilitate something happening that otherwise basically can't happen because of bureaucracy, right? And of course, the onus is on the public agencies to do their due diligence to make sure what public funds are going towards are truly happening, but to keep the process going and to provide incentives for people rather than just penalties, we need that ability to move resources forward. And I do hope that the cost of treating the landscape might potentially go down over time. I think we're right now in a very big catch-up period. We're catching up on a big backlog of stewardship. And I think once we get over the hump, and particularly there's a lot of groups right now like us trying to say, well, where it is safe to use prescribed fire, once you've established those safe conditions, that could be a more cost-effective approach. And so we'll really be working on the ground and seeing how much it costs to do this work. And I think the other thing is the access is a big issue too. Like a property with better access is easier to deal with than a property that's very difficult to access. And so we really have to start prioritizing these treatments adjacent to communities and denser communities, like and on pathways. I keep talking about downwind of the wind-driven fire. Well, we're starting to really map those wind patterns. That's a very cutting edge part of the science, but to really prioritize the first places we need to work and reach out to the landowners in those really strategic locations, say you're a super high priority and we're willing to bring public funds to the table to match this, because there might be, you know, tens of thousands of people downwind of that particular zone that will benefit from that work. So that's where the sort of prioritization comes in, of being able to make a map of the whole county and what are the hot spots, and you know, get the buy-in, provide everyone the same information about what the priorities are. So that's why, like, I personally am working on the technical advisory committee for the multi-jurisdictional integrated hazard mitigation plan for Sonoma County, which is the FEMA document, and making sure that that document reflects this high resolution data we have. And then the next step is our community wildfire protection plan process. And again, I think the role of philanthropy and community-based organizations to assist with the outreach for these plans, because our county is pretty strapped and has had to deal with a lot of disasters one after another. So I think supporting county staff and electeds by getting the word out, and, you know, because we're involved with a lot of grassroots organizations, like, hey, you have this great project, you need to get onto the CWPP website and put it on there. And hey, you know,
I'm gonna get you. This is really important, though. The point that you're making is that often in all work in government, you know, public, private, nonprofit sector, we're so siloed. We're siloed within our silos, even. And what you're talking about is de-siloing, sharing, less turfy, like turf. There's no place for turf wars at this time. But making sure that that everyone understands that we not only have a role to play, but a responsibility to play in mitigating this crisis point that we're at, where climate change is meeting historical lack of land management, and at the same, you know, at the same time we have to put resources into responding to mega fires. So we're in this very systemic crisis, and if we can actually get through it, but we're going to have to be aggressive in our innovation and aggressive in our treatments. And one of the things that I see as unfortunate is when the issue of equity is put up against the issue of land management. And we've seen this play out because, you know, you have allocation of funds. And one of the things that I'm concerned about is if it keeps all burning down, then, and we know for a fact that people who are in any way marginalized will maybe never recover from a disaster. They're more likely to be exposed to the chemicals in the air. They're less likely to have mobility to move, especially in a tight, I mean, now it gets into all these other issues. And so it's not just land management, is also about equity and ensuring safety for all. So that's my soapbox.
No, I think it's hugely important. And, you know, one of the things we've been working on as an organization, we've done a lot of work to county agencies, but what about the voices of frontline communities? You know, I mean, someone at the water agency is going to have a different set of priorities, very important, but what about the frontline communities, including our Latinx communities, who are often the outdoor workers doing this work, by the way? And one of the projects we're excited to be working on right now is a Spanish language video about how to do fuels treatments in a way that is also sensitive to environmental needs, because who is doing this work? A lot of it is our Latinx workforce who's out there. And then what I'm really interested in, and we haven't succeeded yet, we've written a couple of proposals and still looking for partners, but how do we actually have the time to sit down with those folks and get a better sense of what their concerns, risks, and hazards are, so that we can also bring science to bear on those issues. And a big part of that's going to be the air quality, right? Like you know, part of the fire challenge is the exposures to outdoor workers that arise from exposure. So, but also if you are, a traditionally economically disadvantaged community, you really need those economic incentives and partnerships to get the work done in your community. So I think it's both in terms of people as homeowners or property managers, but also the frontline workers who are out there.
I think so much of this goes back to, I appreciate all your efforts on collaboration and strange bedfellows. And I also like that I've learned a lot from you in terms of having a global view of how all of these things like intersect and interact. And so I appreciate that very much. So one of the things that I'd like to note is that when you brought us the idea of this CAL FIRE grant for $1.5 million over 3 years that will really realistically only help probably 40 landowners across 4 counties, but you talked to our board about the importance of actually investing in the system. If we can build the system and it's like open source at that point, and if other other agencies or other NGOs want to take the system that we built, the application system, we invested a lot of money in attorneys and making sure that everything was we have to adhere to CEQA. Everything was ecologically sound and very collaborative. We listened to the foresters, but also ensured that the money was well accounted for. That's a pretty large investment for a small NGO, but our hope, as you said from the very beginning, is that other NGOs could actually take this system and either scale it up or adapt it to their own area. So can you talk about the importance of sharing these best practices, not being protective about them, and just to ensure that we get to the other side of this sort of systemic crisis that we're in?
Sure. Well, I think our program is really a model program that can work. And I think the investment we made in part was, yes, there's a tranche of funds coming from CAL FIRE for this right now from 2020 or whatever year we got it. But once this structure is in place, it's the vehicle for dispersing funds so that other donors can invest and their funds will go directly into the incentives program rather than the program administration, because we've got the administrative kinks figured out. And we certainly were a model. Sonoma County Ag and Open Space District wanted to provide an incentives program. They needed it to come directly from their house, but they basically took our whole structure and then retrofitted it for their needs. And I just think it's a great example of how we can sort of pay it forward with models that work and save other communities the time and effort and research that it took to develop those. And of course, you can always customize it for your own community, but why not cut and paste or recycle? And this is something ever since I've been in the NGO world, like we need to collaborate to share tools, share templates, and expand the footprint beyond where our sort of grassroots efforts land. I mean, I guess I think the other thing I want to mention about strange bedfellows perhaps is this work of working on the landscape. And right now this incentives program, it is somewhat opportunistic based on who's prepared to tackle it, but creating a large scale vision of what our landscape needs to look like to be resilient. Personally, I am now in collaboratives that include equity and workforce and economy. I used to just sit in a room with a bunch of other natural resource managers and advocates, but what I really came to realize in the wake of these fires is that I couldn't be ignorant around the housing and development solutions that are needed for our community to be able to retain people. I mean, we're in a crisis right now where I know the local businesses in my community can't find people to hire because people cannot afford to live in this area. And so, I'm really opening my mind and doors to, let's talk to the development community. Let's talk to the folks that need to come in and do infill and understand that if it's dangerous to put more homes in this wildland urban interface, then we need an economically viable solution to put the home somewhere else. And I think that's biting the bullet as a conservationist, is like you have to also be pro-development in those appropriate places. And right now we're in a collaboration with the Greenbelt Alliance and Ag and Open Space District. We're not policy people. We don't do land use policy. We provide the information, but how do we tighten that circle so we get it into use by the policy advocates? And what we're envisioning right now is actually making a map of Sonoma County that shows where we can be doing these forest treatments, shows where we should be protecting for our food and water supply, shows where you could actually put those homes that we so desperately need, and create alignment between all the different parties who used to be in their silos, so we can go through the general plan update with the county, and the politicians and the county staff can benefit from the fact that the community has aligned around a vision and had those conversations about trade-offs. So I think it's important. I do think there's a lot of members in the environmental community who still think, you know, taking the life of any tree is a horrible thing. And this is where I think the education, outreach, and awareness is so important about the fact that we interrupted the natural cycle that would have been a disturbance cycle where trees came to life, but they would be wiped out by fire, and then that would give a smaller number of trees the chance to thrive and really sequester carbon and be resilient to fire in the long term. And so it's interesting, even within my silo, there's important conversations to have.
And I think, one of the things I like to say is, it's when you do a zero-sum game, most of the time everybody loses. So zero-sum, but if you do collaboration and if you can listen to each other, then you can actually learn a lot, even if you think you know everything about your particular area. I mean, developers should be sitting with environmentalists to figure out how to do this better. We have a lot of housing that is built exactly the way that it's always been, and there are other technologies out there and opportunities. But if developers have to sit on a property and hold it for 5 to 10 years because they keep getting opposed by environmentalists, instead of saying, we want to provide housing, how can we do it in a way that is environmentally sustainable and that is wildfire, resistant, for lack of a better term, home hardening, uses best practices, is beautiful, is near transportation, is better for the environment. Like, let's talk about how to get to yes into what we need, instead of trying to win an argument that we're all at the end of the day just losing. I mean, it doesn't, it's a point of frustration for me when people show up to oppose every single housing development, and they always mention these things, and then they go home to sleep in a meadow. No, they go home and they sleep in a home. We are not, the environmentalists and developers should be at the table always together to talk about these things, because we are kind of waiting for them to get to the other side, or you all to get to the other side. So I appreciate that. And this actually came up in a project that you brought to us also a couple of years ago, called Taking Action for Living Systems. And if you could just briefly touch on that. I enjoyed that. I learned a lot through that project. And I've also seen in the documentary, The West is Burning, how some of those principles have been successfully applied.
Yeah. Well, Taking Action for Living Systems was a wonderful and is a wonderful collaboration between people with forestry expertise, grassroots organizers, landscape designers, climate folks, and private landowners. And I think they're taking this idea of the vision of what is the resilient vision look like, and the terminology Taking Action likes to use is the enterprise complex. What is not just the threats or the things we can't do, but what are the opportunities in this landscape to enhance our water supply, to enhance carbon sequestration, to put homes in. And so we're working quite closely with them in our community that is about 70,000 acres, so it's not small. It's 2 fire safe councils, one based on the Napa side of the Mayacamas Mountains border and one based on the Sonoma side. And we've coordinated those folks into one team. They were impacted by the Tubbs fire and again by the glass, to come up with a plan at the scale of, again, about probably 500 homeowners and landowners to develop a solution. So Taking Action has sort of the concept of this enterprise complex, and now they're really down in the trenches working with people to try to realize that. And the first step really is coming up with, what does this, you can call it a treatment plan or a landscape stewardship overlay. And that's where we really end up helping with some of these data sources we were talking about. It's like, where would you go do a project in this landscape? Where would you start in terms of the highest priority? And I do feel like these sort of what I call sub-regional units sub-county that add up is where you connect each individual landowner to their community and to the resource opportunities.
And to be part of the solution. I mean, everybody likes, given the opportunity, most people will step up if they have a clear path for how to be part of the solution. It's just hard to innovate it, in the meantime. So, as we have, maybe 10 minutes left, I would actually like you to go into what do you see over the next 5 to 10 years in this area of mega fire? It is an era of mega fires. What do you see? And what are your hopes and what are your fears? And what's your advice? It's a lot. I know, it's a lot.
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of the reset, the landscape reset. And so Pepperwood sits directly in an overlap of 2 fires. And I mentioned that can happen, a place can burn, it can burn again. But if you start to look at the fire pattern of the North Bay, it's almost a cookie cutter effect. Those overlap areas don't tend to be very deep. So in some ways, the mega fires are catching up on that backlog for us, whether we like it or not. And I think it's really giving us the challenge of, as I said, I think over the long term, the expense and the effort going to landscape stewardship could reduce over time, but we've got to jump on these burn areas. And we also need to serve those areas that are very prone to fire and haven't burned yet and are threatened, So it's sort of a 2-pronged approach. But I think, this fire season is almost upon us. There's been this sort of urgency, and I would say almost verging on panic. Like, what do we do before August? And that's really important. But we can't let that eclipse our longer term vision. We can't let it eclipse the fact that we want a landscape that is really, we've got to be thinking at a century scale. And that's kind of what Pepperwood is about, is thinking about bigger pieces of the landscape over longer terms. And I, honestly, it's so odd way to put it, but there's a lot of money now getting put up to try to, deal with this fire challenge. But I hope that besides spending it fast on things that seem like an emergency, we can take this longer term view. And that's really why, I'm trying to be at the table to provide that perspective, contributing, to statewide efforts around this issue. And there's no doubt we need to do both, but I think one of the challenges you raised is, in terms of environmental compliance, the California Environmental Quality Act is really a difficult hurdle for especially projects that we wanted to start in March and really get done, to get that done in 6 months. So I do hope that the environmental agencies and environmental community can help solve some of those problems. Certainly we don't want projects going forward without environmental review, but again, how can we at scale address some of those issues? So great examples like the spotted owl. Like, you don't want to be doing a field treatment, even if it's well designed, in the spotted owl habitat when it's happening. It's actually very hard to get that information. It's very expensive to get that information. Is there a way we can streamline that? We do want to protect spotted owls, which have been the victims of horrible crimes against endangered species of the past. But, is there a way you could create a centralized location for a community that could help them get that data fast and say, yes, no, is the spotted owl at risk from this project or not? And if it's not, then let's make it move forward. And is there a way that it cannot take 12 to 18 months to get that answer? So I think that's, for me, within my silo, that's what we kind of need to work on. The air quality issues are similar in that it can be hard to get a prescribed burn permit because of emissions. And we don't quite yet know how to account for the fact that those short-term emissions will be hopefully preventing a longer-term emission source. So, when I look at the state of California's carbon reduction objectives and their greenhouse gas objectives, we're doing great on a lot of fronts, reducing our emissions, except for wildfires. And so that's got to come into the longer-term planning. So I guess keeping the short and the long-term in view, making sure the investments that are coming out fast, that we don't kind of squander them on what feels good or looks good, but doesn't invest in planning. I think that's one of the hardest things, is that funders often want to see results on the ground. But when I talk to my CAL FIRE colleagues, what they're missing is the planning and the prioritization. So I think that's our biggest challenge. How do we meet what feels like a very immediate emergency situation, but also get into the planning mode where we are resourced to have the conversations we need to have, to do some of the sort of analysis we need to do that I think people can get frustrated, like, oh, why are we spending time on this when there could be a fire tomorrow? But we really need to do that work to achieve our goal in a cost-effective fashion.
And what's interesting is as we are opening up our charter to include 11 states, some of this work we might be more successful in learning outside of California and bringing it to California. There's, again, the wildfire risk is not just, as specific to California. Oregon had the worst wildfire season they've ever had on record. And we count 11 states in our new charter because they're the most wildfire vulnerable, and they are almost all of them experiencing severe drought at this time. So I look forward to working with you on that project as well, and just appreciate you so much on a personal and professional level. And I think the work that you're doing is groundbreaking and should be emulated and de-siloed and shared and open source. But again, I always say the three most expensive words in the world are equity, sustainability, and resiliency. So we have to share how we do it, each of those things, so that we can in fact reduce the cost as we share knowledge and use data and facts, and we lose our sacred cows. Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks for being a champion for a science-based approach, and for having the patience to figure out. I mean, there's a lot of translation work that needs to happen between the silos, and I think making this work accessible, and also the emphasis of the human spin on it. Even scientists are human. We hate to admit it, but it is true. And that's the sort of collaborations and relationships I think will make us successful. I couldn't agree with you more. We have as much to learn from people working at this larger scale. And I think it's that two-way thing, right? Like, what's going to work for that individual person at their home, but how does that relate to the globe as a whole? And there are these sort of intermediate scales that need to talk to each other so that we share the knowledge and get it implemented as swiftly as possible.
Innovate. We can do this. Well, thank you again, Dr. Lisa Micheli, CEO and President of Pepperwood Preserve. You can find her contact information at the very beginning of this podcast. And thank you for being on How to Disaster.
Thank you so much. And thanks for your creativity.
Fannie Mae, the largest provider of mortgage finance in the U.S., owns 1 out of every 4 loans in the country. You can find out if Fannie Mae owns your mortgage at knowyouroptions.com by using our loan lookup tool. This last year has been quite difficult, and making your mortgage payments could be too. There are options for those available that may have experienced a natural disaster such as wildfire or the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the options available is a forbearance plan, where homeowners are given a period of reduced or suspended payments to manage a temporary hardship of financial standing. For this caused by natural disaster or COVID-19 pandemic, you could be eligible for a 6-month extension with a possibility of another 6 months after that. During the forbearance plan, the homeowner is not charged late fees. If you received additional living expense assistance after your disaster, and those funds have run out, you still may be eligible to apply for a forbearance plan. When your forbearance plan ends, your lending or servicer will contact you to see if you need assistance or are ready to resume making your normal scheduled mortgage payments. If you don't hear from them, you should proactively reach out. If you are unable to repay the balance in its entirety, you may arrange a repayment plan, or if eligible, qualify for other programs such as a payment deferral or flex modification. A payment deferral allows you to bring your mortgage current. This option keeps your monthly mortgage payment the same as it was before your hardship, and the total deferred amount will be due on the last scheduled payment of the loan. Should you sell or refinance, the deferred balance is included in the remaining amount due. Flex modification is Fannie Mae's standard modification. It provides 20% principal and interest payment reduction on your mortgage. Once the modification is complete, the loan's term is extended to 40 years. Depending on the circumstances, the modification may result in a reduction of interest rate and/or principal forbearance. What is a principal forbearance, by the way? And that's when a portion of the unpaid principal balance, basically the remaining loan amount, is put into an interest-free balance secured by the loan as part of the flex modification. It can be modified by the maturity date or with an early payoff. More information is available at knowyouroptions.com. When ready to request mortgage assistance, reach out to your mortgage company. This is the company you send your payments to each month, and you'll find that phone number on your mortgage statement. Additional relief assistance is available through our disaster response network. Here, impacted homeowners can work with HUD-approved housing counselors to get help requesting financial relief through FEMA, insurance claims, and more. Homeowners can visit knowyouroptions.com/relief for more information or call 877-833-1746. Once again, 877-833-1746 or knowyouroptions.com.
Thank you for joining us on How to Disaster, a playbook to recover, rebuild, and reimagine. I want to leave you with this one thought. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we want you to know that you can get through this. You can recover, rebuild, and reimagine, but there's only one way you're going to do it, and that's together.